Good evening, everybody. Welcome to BAK. My name is Maria Hlavajova. I'm Artistic Director at BAK, and I welcome you also on behalf of the team. We set up this evening as a hybrid gathering, so welcome those of you who came here to BAK, albeit in limited numbers, following the measures of public health instances here in the Netherlands, and welcome those of you who connected to this event online. This hybrid local physical and other digital co-presence will also be featured in terms of contributors to the event, and I'm very much looking forward to this. For those of us who gather here together, a couple of rules that I would like to read out to make sure that we take care of each other's health. Please wear face coverings at all times, keep distance, physical distance, that is, not social distance. Wash your hands as often as you can. Please respect the maximum of human bodies in each respective space as indicated. In return, we will do our duty, our part. We'll clean, disinfect as often as necessary, whichever parts are necessary to be disinfected. These have been or still are two quite extraordinary days, because yesterday and today we've been in a staggered manner reopening the exhibition of Tony Coates, To Live as Equals. Yesterday evening we gathered on the occasion of the launch of BAK's most recent publication, edited by Sven Lutheken, Deserting from the Culture Wars. And today we're gathering on the occasion of another remarkable book, My Name is Language, by Nicoline van Harskamp. And I'm very excited for this opportunity. Now, it was in 2016 where we at BAK, in our previous venue, actually hosted an exhibition, solo exhibition by Nicoline van Harskamp called the Englishes. It was Englishes exhibition, where Nicoline showed work that engaged with exploring the widespread use and modification of the English language by its non-native speakers, such as myself. Englishes depicted the development of the plurality of spoken English that displays still the perceived position of primacy occupied by dominant strains of the language. All the work addressed the political import of this linguistic development, pointing out how our use of language is consistently entrenched in structures of class and power. Challenging these connotations, Nicoline proposes a dissolution of English into Englishes, if you will, co-opting it as a common and ever-growing linguistic resource. Englishes thus became a site of solidarity, Englishes as an exhibition, be that through the expressivity of speech or by a claiming common right to edit. Alongside multiple works in the exhibition, I very vividly recall a new short fiction film that BAK co-produced called PDGN from 2016 that drew conclusions from a number of projects that Nicoline has been involved in to put forward an unlikely but desirable global linked language. The predicted version of English, which may not sound like any language we know today, is partly or was partly in the exhibition automated by PDGN software, designed especially for that particular occasion. It was conceptualized with the help of software designers, Esperantists, recreational language inventors, and academics in fields such as Creole studies, computational linguistics, and language evolution. This beautiful book that we're launching today in the Netherlands is in some ways a continuation of a variety of strands of research that these works introduced. I cannot be more excited to just offer this floor to Nicoline to start up the program this evening. Thank you so much, Nicoline.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, BAK, for hosting this event tonight. Thank you, Hidde, also, for your support. Thank you, everybody in the room, for being here in person. It means a lot to me, so I'm grateful for your presence. And thank you for those zooming in, joining us online. Is this good sound, or should I take a little distance? Better like this. Now, this evening is centered around this book, My Name is Language. It's very awkward to not have the book in your hands during a book launch, but I want to start off saying that we also made an electronic version of this book by Eclectic. You can download it now if you're watching this online. It has special features, audio and animation. And you can, of course, also get it from the archive website, a hard copy. Now, the many people who've contributed to this book, and even more people who've lent their voices to the scripts that appear in this book, I cannot start to thank at this specific place, but I would like to thank those people without whom the book would not be here. First of all, that is Achim Lengerer, founder of Scriptings in Berlin. Scriptings is an art space dedicated to text and scripting as integral parts of art practices. And this book is part of a series called Political Scenarios that he co-publishes with Archive Books. So, of course, I'd like to thank Chiara Figone and Paolo Caffoni at Archive for their commitment. And to thank Janine Zak from Eclectic for guiding me into the world of e-publication and for making a beautiful edition. It's worth, even if you have the book, to get the EPUB. Now, Achim has the wisdom to make books very slowly. And we spend a lot of time preparing the concepts for the book, the authors, the plans, and then the design. And for the design, we met for a very long time, 1 hour a week, which is a very unusual process, but I think it paid off. And with us was our fantastic graphic designer, Julie Heugner, and at a later stage, our proofreader, Naim Damfi, who had a very hard task of working with a lot of different languages and as many different Englishes. I'd like to thank the Mondrian Fund, of course, who made this production possible. Someone else who made this production possible is Victor Martens, who is watching this from our home. Thank you all. Now, this book brings together works from the last 4 years. And all the works that are covered in this book deal with the future of linked language, the future of naming, names as language. And the oldest work in the book is the aforementioned PDGN, which I produced together with BAK. And one of the scenes in that video actually deals with our women of the future, who are the protagonists in the book, talking about how names are created in their respective lands. And this scene is actually the starting point of a longer series of works called My Name is Language that I staged ever since. I've made an edition of this work, of this series in Dublin with Project Art Center and in Graz with Starische Herbst. In the Ruhrgebiet, I worked with Britta Peters' Ruhrding, and in Antwerp recently with the Mucka. And I'm preparing an Amsterdam edition of this work with the Amsterdam Museum. And that's coming out in March next year. Even if we have to stream it, we will still do it. Now, each of these editions, each of these performance pieces is set in a waiting room of a bureaucratic institution. The kind of institution where you are waiting for your name to be called. And sometimes they were real existing institutions, and sometimes they were recreated waiting rooms. And in the room, an audience is mixed in with a number of performers who are waiting together, and one after the other of the performers speaks a story about names and their relation to languages. And they do that in whatever language is required. So that means that translation as a subject and translation as a form of empowerment or as a tool for emancipation is actually very much part of this work. And then, of course, as a result, is the notion of incomprehension. Now, in the book, you'll find a compilation of these monologues that were created in the process. And tonight, I have asked 4 people, Ilse van Rijn, Rachael Rakes, Canan Marasligil, and Maria Hlavajova, to read up a single monologue each and then reflect on it briefly from their own respective expertise or interests. And the text I've offered them to pick from all deal with the idea of unnaming or self-naming. I'm quickly going to introduce our 4 speakers. Ilse van Rijn, a researcher, writer, and art historian, working among other places at the Sandberg Institute, the Rietveld Academy, Das Graduate School, and the University of Amsterdam. Now, I got to know Ilse a long time ago as an art historian who writes about artists who write. And she is also very dedicated to language and art, poetry, feminism. There are many reasons why I'm very happy that she is here tonight. Rachael Rakes is curator of public practice at BAK, and she's editor-at-large for Verso Books and programmer-at-large for the Film Society of the Lincoln Center in New York. And she was, until fairly recently, the head curator and manager of the curatorial program at the Appel in Amsterdam. Canan Marasligil is a feminist writer, editor, artist, literary translator, and curator of cultural programs. And I very recently got to know her, and I was very impressed with her advocacy for translation and linguistic representation. And she's a multilingual, multidisciplinary person, so I'm grateful to have her also in our midst today. Maria Hlavajova is the founding director of BAK, basis actuele kunst in Utrecht. And she was the instigator and co-curator of numerous projects here, including future vocabularies and propositions for non-fascist living. That said, there are 2 more guests tonight, and we will listen to them first. They are giving short lectures, and they are actually joining us from different time zones. From Providence in the United States, we have Avishek Ganguly joining us. Avishek is a researcher and an associate professor at Rhode Island School of Design, and his work focuses on intersections of translation, theater, performance, and, which is probably the reason we first met, global Englishes. And he was a visiting researcher, a fellow at the Freie Universität in Berlin, where we met, after which we have been in irregular contact over the years, and I was very happy that he agreed to write the opening essay of the book, and his talk will be based on that essay. Our second guest is Antonia Alampi, and she is joining us from Martinique, although usually she works from Berlin, where she was until recently the co-artistic director of Savvy Contemporary, and she is now leading a Spoor initiative in Berlin. She also works on the curatorial team for Sonsbeek 2020 in Arnhem. Antonia curated an exhibition at Savvy as part of the Haroun Farocki retrospective in 2017. And that took as a start the name modification that Farocki did a long time ago as a starting point for an exhibition and theoretical work. So that's the first moment where I thought I really wanted to invite her, but I look forward to hearing her response in other ways also to the book. Then after 2 short lectures and 4 reflections and readings, we'll have some time for questions and a discussion. But first, I would like now to give the word to Avishek Ganguly. I can see him here on our screen. Avishek, first of all, thank you for your contribution to the book and for being with us tonight. And I'll now give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Nicoline. Can you hear me? Can you nod so that I know you can hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Nicoline. It's really great to see the book out in the world, even though I have not held it in my hands. But I know we've been having these conversations over the years, and it's something that I'm obviously very, very I think deeply about. So it's great to have worked with you together on this Thank you for the opportunity to write. Thank you, BAK, everybody at BAK, and especially to Hide and Thomas for making this possible in a mediated online way. I guess I'll just kind of I'll do a mix of talking a little bit about the piece that I wrote and also Nicoline's work, but generally the topics of Englishes and translation and incomprehension, a little more than probably the topic of naming and names. And but I'll also read a little bit in between, from kind of the essay that was published. So so much of this is really a conversation and thinking around what the Trinidadian Canadian poet Emnor Beze Philip calls the anguish of English. It's the dilemma of English, and I guess one can replace it with any language which has a colonial legacy and a presence and has survived into the present. So I'll read a little bit first from the essay. It's called Global Englishes, Rough Futures. In 1905, Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain, a Bengali Muslim woman in British-ruled India, published a short story titled Sultana's Dream in the Indian Ladies magazine, an English-language periodical based in Madras, now Chennai. In the story, the narrator has a dream in which she is transported to a far-off ladyland, and I quote from the text, where ladies rule over the country and control all social matters, whilst gentlemen are kept in the mardanas to cook, to mind babies, and to do all sorts of domestic work. This is 1905. In a nod to a feminist critique of science, this witty utopian tale of radical gender role reversal also invoked technological innovations that made life easier. So Rachael wrote about solar cookers, flying cars, cloud condensers for providing clean water. Sultana's Dream was one of the first, or one of the earliest published examples of self-consciously feminist speculative fiction written by a woman writer in English. And this was 10 years before, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the American feminist utopian novel Heartland. It was decades prior to Marge Pierce's classic Woman on the Edge of Time, something that also Nicoline refers to in her work. English, however, was Hossain's fifth language after Bengali, Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Deprived of the opportunity of formal schooling within a conservative social milieu, but determined to get an education, she was able to learn the language with a little help from a couple of, progressive men in her life. First, her brother, who taught her in secret, and then her husband, who was a civil servant in the British colonial administration, who encouraged her to write in English. Begum Rokeya, she's better known in West Bengal, the state of West Bengal, in India, but also across the border in Bangladesh, went on to have a thriving writing career in Bengali and is remembered today as a trailblazing educator, political organizer, and activist for gender equality and women's rights. When I teach a seminar called Global Englishes, I usually begin with Sultana's Dream. We start with Englishes elsewhere, and then we look in on what is the Anglo-American dominant version of the language, to use kind of modify slightly the term that Edward Said had used, the term voyage in. I'm talking about looking in. He had talked about voyage in to describe a similar intellectual journey almost 35 years ago, talking about how texts from what was the so-called the third world texts made their journey, and authors and texts from the third world made their journey into quote unquote first world classrooms and settings. Our goal in my classes is to read and listen to a selection of text across media that confound normative notions of what is a native speaker. We also aim to reveal the idea of the original and the authentic as fiction, to displace and destabilize the notion of the original and the authentic, and to reveal them that these are fictions that we tell ourselves and we convince ourselves, and that are often backed by discourses of power, which is why they function. Non-native speakers of English and feminist speculative fiction play compelling roles in the artistic production of Nicoline van Harskamp. Inspired by the fact that non-native speakers of English already outnumber native speakers, the artist tries to imagine the future shape of a global link or mixed language through a series of performance-based works. In the video that was mentioned earlier, PDGN, it's a play on PDGN, Pidgin. That's how I read it. It's a video. It shows for example, a group of women who are working and chatting in a setting. It's kind of its arid landscape, shot in brown, which is kind of apocalyptic, but not quite dystopian. And we see the women talking amongst themselves. But what is interesting is that the language in which these women speak to each other remains completely unintelligible to the viewers. Perhaps, and this is my conjecture, the experience of incomprehension constitutes a way of seeing the work. Every work, every piece of work, piece of art, piece of writing desires to be read, to be seen in certain ways. I'm proposing that the experience of incomprehension, that again was Nicoline had mentioned earlier in her introduction, is probably a way that the work offers how it wants to be read and listened to and seen. So this is kind of this is the way to one way to describe the language is I'm calling it not quite not English, the way it plays out. There is an undeniable richness to this artifice, this unlikely but desirable linguistic medium that Van Harskamp has created in PDGN, which invites multiple ways of listening. We could, Nicoline calls it a vehicular language, which obviously has echoes of the Martinican thinker Edouard Glissant, where Antonia is situated right now. But we could also describe as a simulacrum of English with a residual attachment to Esperanto or even to basic English, and all of which have been aspirants to a certain kind of simplified global English. What animates Van Harskamp's work, as she has stated on more than one occasion, and this is important, is a desire to co-opt English for purposes other than those that consolidate its current hegemonic status. What follows in PDGN is then an aesthetic proposal for communicating in the future that is based on varieties of English spoken by real people who use them as their second or third or even fourth language. These Englishes were then scripted and employing a list of interesting text-changing algorithms that Nicoline calls distorters, which relate primarily to sound and speech. Now, her express intention, as I read it in this body of work, is to render the language, the English in this case, somewhat indecipherable for the viewer, incomprehensible for the viewer. Although she says that with careful reading, or rather listening, the viewers or the listeners might be able to understand it. I'm going to come back to this soon. But before that, the idea of the English as, in this case with Rachael, I call her English as a fifth language. What does it even, how do we even begin to think of an artist or a writer who use English as a second, third, fourth, fifth language? English as a second language is a construction we know more, ESL. And there are also something that I've written elsewhere about how, for example, processes like the TOEFL exam or the Cambridge certificates in English, teaching and English eligibility. These are all interesting ways of constructing and determining this figure of who counts as a native speaker, right? So the other kind of related to other aspects that I want to talk a little bit about today in Nicoline's work have to do with the emphasis or the explicit emphasis on voice and therefore sound that is there, and the idea of distortion and incomprehension that I've already briefly mentioned. These are important strands in my own work, and I am it's interesting to think. It's been very productive to think through and think with Nicoline's work on these topics. So I would say that how we think about these two kind of factors, two vectors of operation of a language, one could say any dominant language, but in this case English, has or might have profound ethical and political implications for conceptualizing the present and future of Englishes. In my video works and stage works, Nicoline writes, the spoken word, that is embodied language, is a medium and a central topic. As a complement to this act of speaking, one critique has read her work, was rightly identified a careful, to quote, a careful forensics of listening in her practice. I would venture further and read her foregrounding of a non-textual mode in her work as symptomatic of a new and interesting shift in the ways in which we are used to thinking about global Englishes. Now, the discourse of global Englishes has mostly been, thought about in the disciplines of literature, English literature, or linguistics. And in literature, a large part of the discussion has focused around written texts and how writing in English circulates, and in different ways, different genres. That's more or less kind of been the dominant mode. Instead, I would argue, and the novel in English, the global novel in English, which circulates through all this kind of prizes, the Booker Prize, and that circuit is what forms this. I would argue instead that we can gather a more representative, and dare I say, a more egalitarian sense of the lives of global Englishes from directing our attention to the soundscape of these languages, to their use in everyday life, to their production, circulation, and reception in and as performance. This, I believe, is the burden of Englishes in Nicoline's work. The succinct version of the assumption behind this argument is that English circulates more widely in the world in its spoken and heard avatars than in its read or written manifestation. In other words, the number of people who use English for official work or listen to English news bulletins, for instance, are significantly more than those who are able to read, let's say, novels in the language or watch films in the language. I mean, this might sound very commonsensical, but this is still a conjecture, and we need empirical data to back this up. But to mark the shift in and simultaneous expansion of the domain of global Englishes, we could start by asking some direct questions related to the knowledge of and access to the language in the first place. Who speaks English in most of the world? Who has the opportunity to learn English, and under what circumstances? Where do most people come across English? What purpose does English serve for most people with varying degrees of proficiency in the language, beyond promising, as I said, the ability to read novels, write, or even watch films or media? It should, of course, be obvious that that the group of non-native speakers is a heterogeneous group. It's not a homogeneous group of non-native speakers because of different situations in which one comes to a language and different levels of proficiencies. And then there is the matter of accents. Which pronunciations of English are widely heard, and in which situations? Which accents secure someone a job interview or enable them to access a helpline in a crisis? Whose English is supposed to have authority? Whose English is considered difficult to understand? Which accent outs someone as a misfit, as a non-native speaker, and sets them up for discrimination? Which accents sound suspicious, trigger secondary inspections at border checkpoints? Which accents warrant demands for more documents? These questions are not exhaustive, merely an inventory of possible ways to direct our inquiries. In Nicoline's work, for instance, many of the voices we hear belong to national minorities or groups of recently arrived immigrants who have learned to speak the language, often under duress. As has been well documented, English, particularly in societies that have experienced British colonial rule, functions as a language of power and upward mobility. But this is a little more complicated than that. For instance, in the Indian situation, I mean, class is the most common marker that comes up when we talk about the different access to English and questions of upward mobility. In the Indian situation, for example, specifically, the sociologist Satish Deshpande has recently talked about, and this has increasingly been discussed, as to how caste plays a role in hiding the origins of English and access to English, and how it plays out. So how English, being a tool and an instrument in one generation, begins to function as an attribute or just a character trait in another generation. What is often not told in this is not just the story of class, which is more obvious, but also its intersection with caste. And of course, gender, as we were talking about, is very central to this particular work that, that Nicoline is talking about. So, so what has perhaps been less examined are the various vibrant circuits of English beyond the production and circulation of text, especially those of literary fiction written in the language. This situation also holds true for how we've come to understand the act of translation. Again, something that we've mentioned briefly. Another significant practice for Nicoline's work, and which is primarily, again, thought of as, has been mostly thought of as a textual transaction. Efforts to imagine a transmedia concept of translation, something that I'm also involved in, and a concept of translation that does not only privilege writing, resonate with what I'm trying to argue here about the extra-textual manifestations of English. In spite of years of efforts by scholars and writers to counter dominant notion of translation and English or French or Hindi or Arabic, you know, the kind of all this with the uppercase, the capital, French with capital F, Hindi with capital H, Arabic with capital A, and English with capital E. We still have, you know, attempts have been made to dispel the cult of the authentic of the original, the idea that somehow there is a pristine version of a text or an artwork or music or language that will somehow always be better and truer than every rendition or variation that comes afterward continues to hold sway in the public sphere. Talking about her conception of the medium of her work, Nicoline says, in PDGN, a future language based on English is largely opaque. The characters explain something about themselves to each other, not to the public. The public has the task to relate to them and learn to identify them. Opacity forces the dominant culture to do what Edward Glissant calls the experience of relationship, an experience of kinship. The apparent inscrutability of these link Englishes from the future, Nicoline claims, exhorts the audience and the viewer to do some careful reading or listening or viewing in the interest of forming a relationship. Glissant, of course, offers a brilliant way to think about such a poetics and politics of relation. And I would mention him briefly in closing. I hope I would have the time. But what happens, let's ask, if a work of fiction stages an encounter with incomprehension? What transpires when the audience is unable to read the language being staged? Read as, of course, metaphor, listen to, understand, make sense of. Thinking about these questions will take us beyond the domain of Englishes and towards an ethics and politics of translation. It's a question that I had the opportunity to discuss with the Delhi-based group of artists, the Rakes Media Collective, who a lot of whose work, talks about translation in these ways, and talking about a specific piece of theirs where they work with 3 different languages in a kind of takeaway piece, which has Urdu and Bengali and English, 3 prominent languages in the South Asian subcontinent. And I asked them, you know, how do you approach the idea when somebody says that they can't read all of the languages, they don't understand? The artist's response was that find someone who can read it for you. This experience of incomprehension then becomes an occasion for companionship, an open-ended invitation to the stranger. In the waiting rooms of My Name is Language, in which over a dozen languages are used during a single performance, a lack of complete comprehension is a given. When Nicoline stages incomprehension in its use of language that is best imaginable instead of being the most likely future scenario, it offers an invitation to listen better. It provides an almost playful exercise to train the ears of the audience to unfamiliar sounds and phrases. Writing about a similar encounter with incomprehension many years ago, the theorist thinker Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak had called this experience uncanny. She was using the word uncanny in the Freudian sense. The sense of, and I quote, the experience of contained alterity in an unknown language spoken in a different cultural milieu is uncanny. And in the German sense, obviously, the unheimlich and is unhoming, the unhomely. Do the distortions in action in the language in PDGN, borrowed in some cases from feminist speculative fiction, then unhome standard English? The experience of the limits of one's knowledge and incomprehension faced with the unfamiliar is usually alienating and unfamiliar, uncanny, for speakers of a dominant language who are always used to understanding things, who are always used to getting things. But in Spivak's deconstructive practice, this becomes an occasion for the ethical. It is indeed possible or desirable to approach such an experience with humility, even self-effacement. That is the challenge for the hegemonic, I would say, for the hegemonic monolingual speaker of a dominant language, not an occasion to resent and recoil at the limits of one's own incomprehension, at one's failure to understand the foreign, the different, but to respond to this as an invitation to be ethical, to remain intended towards the other. Nicoline's body of work is an invitation and an occasion to ponder all of these questions. And I would just end, I guess, I'm keeping an eye on the time. It's almost 20 minutes. I just wanted to end with a quote which speaks to the idea of, kind of takes this idea of distortion that she talks about in her work, and say that, her reading of that is very provocative, and it's full of possibilities. And I think that is an invitation to imagine a future with English in a minor key. And that would also move to a notion of creolization in Glissant. As Glissant observes, there is one thing we can be sure of. A lingua franca, humanistic French, Anglo-American Sabir, or Esperanto, is always apoetical. By eschewing a desire for a lost and therefore irrecoverable universal language, a desire that has been shaped by specific histories, then we are offered a glimpse, I would say, of a future poiesis where English is not only not dominant, but it is also made, unmade, and remade every day. A future that I call, as in my title, Rough Future for Global Englishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Avishek. I think I'm looking in the right camera to say thank you for this. I'm really glad that you mentioned at the end this term distortion again. Now I have to see you in that side. Because we actually went back and forth on that term quite a bit. And also, I remember when we were working on the project here at BAK, Maria had some things to say about that term. And I always felt that was going to be something that people would kind of respond to, which is probably why I left it in. Because distortion, as you said, it was explained it to you, sounded like something that is negative or normative, perhaps, a distortion from what is standard, in a way. Whereas I see it as something that is part of music. It's actually a term from music where you distort sound so that it actually sounds different. But within the distortion, and this is why I'm coming back to this again now, within the distortion there is something also that is missing, because normally if you distort something you lose information or you lose certain things. And today there are quite a few texts that we will read are about the loss of names or the loss of information. So I wanted to ask you, have you reconsidered this idea about distortion as a negative, or has this stayed the same? Let's say.
No, thank you. I know, I it's been great to go back and forth on this. No, I think it's a kind of, looking at, the more I think about it, I think it's a necessary, a necessary disturbance if we want to stay with the kind of sound and frequency analogy, which is probably the way I think you are using it in my reading, is that it's kind of a necessary rite of passage to get to where you're trying to take us. So I think, the so-called negativity of this is also contextual, right? I mean, we talked about the idea of broken English, right? I mean, it's one thing that when we say broken English, then in a certain context, it might indicate a certain kind of failure and inadequacy. But on the other hand, you could just, the artist, the practitioner could just claim it and use it, right? So there is always that possibility. So I think it's really contextual, but I do understand that, the way I think you are using it is really to give it a kind of I mean, a kind of a productive, I mean, to produce what you are trying to produce, to get to what you are trying to get to, I think it's a necessary step. And I don't think it's, it's not so simple to say whether it's negative or positive. I think it's provocative. I mean, it's making this conversation possible. So I think it's great.
True,
it should be there.
Okay, good to hear. Thank you again. I would like to use that also as a little bridge to our next speaker, Antonia Alampi, where we talk about thinking of the changing of names and if you wish, a distortion of the own name or the simplification or amplification of the own name. I would like to give the word to Antonia. Can you hear us okay from where we are?
Yes.
Yes?
Can you?
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Nicoline, and thank you so much, everyone, for being there, even though it's a kind of abstraction because I basically only see an empty stage in front of me. So it's an act of, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I actually prefer that. Yes, thank you for inviting me and also inviting me to delve into the book and the research that certainly echoes, I would say, a lot of work that actually I've been engaged with in the past years. The issue of languages, naming, the relationship between the language of the states and the vernacular languages that sort of gravitate around it has been quite predominant in even institutional thinking. I think of a few organizations that I've been working with in the past. And I was just talking to Avishek before about actually some programs that we did in Cairo. I used to live in Cairo and was part of an organization called Beirut in Cairo and founded by Sarah Rifkin and Jens Meyer-Rote. There we curated a show called Writing with the Other Hand is Imagining. And it was all around the relationship between Arabic, written Arabic, classical Arabic as the language of the state and of religion, and the different, spoken Arabics that are not the mother tongue of anyone, so Arabic in that sense that powerful language of the state is only a father tongue, and what type of, relation that actually creates, and perhaps also what political structures that sort of encourages and plays a role in keeping. But of course, also, as you mentioned, I curated a show a few years ago together with Bonaventure Ndikung for Savi Contemporary. And I must say this was really actually his idea, which was that we were invited to curate an exhibition, part of a series of shows around the work of Harun Farocki, that happened in Berlin. And as always, as Savi, we always try to sort of shed light where light is not already, so to speak. And there was something that we decided to pause on, which was the changing of Harun's name, which he did very early on, as his original name was actually Harun El Osman Farocki with QH, which is actually quite spread and common in Pakistan. And well, that gave way to a series, to an exhibition that was kind of reflecting around name changing and its various aspects, from name change being something that is imposed, right? Because there's a lot of actually historical moments in which literally the name change was imposed on the population for very different reasons, mostly related to occupation. To the need of name, two occasions of name change for the opposite, as an act of resistance. For example, just think about the many writers, female writers, that had to change their name in order to be published and hence to sound or to become avatars with male names. And there's various works, for example, of Shilpa Gupta that really created some sort of a huge library looking into the many different occasions and instances of name change in relationship to publication. However, I am currently in Martinique, as you said. I'm here as part of a research for a new institution that I'm directing that will open in Berlin next year, end of 2021. And of course, by reading the book and the many things that it engages with, I could not but pick up on Edouard Glissant, who's mentioned many times, and by both Avishek and I would say you, whether directly or indirectly. And there's so many relationships that one can trace, both in the relationship between naming and language and making languages, and the relationship between languages and renaming. And I want to actually to start by a beautiful encounter, and this is the way conversations very often start. A few days ago, I was having dinner with somebody called Emmanuel Nosson, and he is what you would define an ethnopharmacologist, which means somebody who's engaging with medical knowledge that is not just sort of Western scientific knowledge, so to speak, but actually herbal medical knowledge, particularly from the Caribbean, and works into processes of, let's say, scientific legitimization of that popular knowledge in order to distribute it also in sort of, medical places. We were having dinner, and then he was looking at a fruit and a flower that I had on the table, and he was like, "Oh, you know how this is called?" And I was like, "Maracuya." He was like, "Oh, I'm very happy to hear that you know the name maracuya, because it's actually usually mostly known as passion fruit." And I want to show it to you. Right, this is a passion fruit. I bet many of you probably heard it under the name of passion fruit. And this is how the conversation started, as this wonderful fruit's primary name actually comes from the Guarani language. And Guarani language, I just want to pause for who doesn't know what the Guarani language is. It is one of the most widely spoken American languages and remains actually commonly used among Paraguay and various neighboring countries. There's Guarani also in Brazil and in various. And it's quite unique among American languages, as the language shift towards European colonial languages has otherwise been a nearly universal phenomenon in the Western Hemisphere. So the primary name of these fruits in Guarani is the breeding of flies, which I also find interesting because, again, and this is something that comes up in the book, the word has a meaning, breeding of flies, because the flower that gives the names to the fruit seems particularly attractive for flies. Now, the word maracuya that I knew is a kind of, and I, instead of distortion, use corruption, a Portuguese corruption of the Guarani version. But still the questions arose why is it widely known as passion fruit? And actually, because of its image, I always thought it was kind of related to something different. Actually, the name was given in the 1700s by Christian missionaries in Brazil. And it was basically used as an educational aid while trying to convert the indigenous inhabitants to Christianity. So its name at the time that the missionaries gave was Flor das Cinco Chagas. That was the name of the flower of the 5 vows, to illustrate literally the crucifixion and what is called as the Passion of Jesus, which actually is, made as many different moments. And the Passion of Jesus is more or less the different things that happen once he enters Jerusalem. So it's literally the period of his final life. And this is also what gave name to its so-called scientific name of both the flower and the plant and the fruit. So the scientific name of the flower is passiflora, from Latin, of course, and then becomes always the scientific name, precisely for this reason. And I wanted to draw for you this picture, essentially to call attention to a few aspects of the process, of the act, of the power and problematics embedded in the act of naming. How the act of naming is deeply entangled with colonial processes, how the imposition of the use of a language is part of forms of oppression and cultural hegemony. And here the link to Gramsci is also kind of brought about in various moments in the book, and its relation to notions of so-called, quote, discovery, and to perversing and perturbing established structures. So the name. The name is a first sign of identity, recognition. It's a belonging, legitimacy, and continuity, carries in itself this measure of the past and of duration, which is also something that Glissant very much engages with. A duration, not yet a historical consciousness lived as such, but one whose true density is contained through its very form by the name. Now, the issue of name and of naming, as has been mentioned various times already, is extremely present in Edouard Glissant's work. And the ways in which I'm actually bringing it up here is extremely, if not entirely, indebted with the work of another Martinican academic whose name is Prisca de Gras, who has written and published extensively about issues of naming in the Americas, and especially the obsession of naming both of the colonizers, but also how l'obsession du nom, which is the title of a book she wrote, in the fictional and literary genres in the Americas. The problem of the name, and more generally that of naming, and I quote her here, lies inscribed an obstinate attempt to rename a world, a community, and to make of its history with a capital H, its histories, plural, and its stories, a significant, meaningful ensemble beyond the disorder, chaos, and misery that are the necessary lots of colonial histories. For this reason, the name, and here the name is capital, represents a significant textual constellation and at the same time an obvious historical, social, and cultural preoccupation, end of quote. In essence, the problem of naming, she writes, is the problem and the concern of all those who speak Creole and of all Caribbean writers. As you may know, and as many have written about extensively, basically, enslaved people, in addition to everything else, such as land, objects, plants, flowers, everything was renamed. But also enslaved people, were given new names. And the names that they were given were usually the names of, quote, owners. So they had their family name, which was secret, and their parental name, which was secret and unknown. There's something beautiful that Bonaventure writes about the fact that you know my name because you've given me my name. Sorry, the opposite. I know. There's one name that you know, which is the one you've been given to me, but you don't actually know my real name, which at the same time represents a potential or a possibility of resistance or of deception. So they had their family name, secret and unknown, to the white masters. Now, at stake in the aftermath of one of the most atrocious events of world history, which is slavery, that went on here for 3 centuries, is the effort to look at naming again and rename through the work of a community, which is something that Glissant very much focuses on, bringing to light an expression through which the community can recognize itself. A pertinent language, that's how Glissant calls it. And as Nicoline hints at, very, very often with her work, it is about the multiple possibilities that the community possesses to name itself, not to be named, to name itself, to choose a name. And this is something that, again, Glissant very interestingly writes about, which is the need to express, right? That has been confronting itself with the impossible to express. The confrontation, the tension between what there is to be expressed and the imposed language for it, a form by which what needs to be expressed can actually not find a possibility of expression. And this is also what Degas mentions very often, which is the case of the French West Indies, where the mother tongue Creole and the official language French constantly creates an undetected torment in the French West Indian conscience. And that's something she writes about. I quote her, undetected torment in the conscience. Expression, she goes on, in order to mark its lack of autonomy, strikes itself with a sort of non-power, a sort of impossibility. And the possible solution of this impossibility of naming, she says, resides as much as in the refusal of the name as in its proclamation. Example of this double process. So the process, the possibility of naming on the one hand, and the refusal of the name with the capital A. It's always, are numerous in the literary works of the Americas. So she beautifully asks, quote, between the ancient names, those of the Pays d'Avant, which the countries of the forefathers. So between the ancient names, between the names of the countries of the forefathers, whose traces were lost in a night of memory that covers more than 3 centuries. And these strange names that cannot really be ours, is it possible to create new ones? She asks. And very similarly, Glissant asks, can writing, and this is, I think it's very interesting and it's a connection to what Avishek also wrote about, can writing, whether prose or poetry, can writing force the conjuring up and the naming of a past whose continuous overshadowing projects us into and keeps us in a constant state of absence, and in this void that we need to overcome or replenish. And no, Degas says that history cannot be compensated. by renaming, of course. The compensation cannot happen by renaming, but indeed writing can still play a role of defense, a reparation perhaps. And that's where how the name functions in Edouard Glissant's work, which is a kind of a double metaphor. It plays and works as the metaphor of history with a capital H, and second as a metaphor of language, whose necessary invention can compensate for the lack of la langue. And there's a famous novel that he writes, Mahogany, in which basically the eyes and the narrators are multiple narrators. And there's one particular character that writes, in which he writes about. This character, he writes stories. He comments on the whole world because his name is the inversion of the name of the colonizers. His name is Senglis. He thinks he has a duty. Fortunately, he doesn't pretend to have a mission. And this is what somehow, again, de Graaf after de Glissant tries to talk about in these names, in these forgotten names, these borrowed names, these parodied names, these names of freedom, these chosen names, is inscribed the tumult of a history for which the writing is always difficult, unmistakably painful, but which can find in the name one of its path to its revelation. That's something she writes so strongly. And this is basically the power of the name given in a community, as Glissant writes, as a form of resistance to the state record of names, which is also, I think, what, again, has been very often written about, right? Like here, the official register of naming, essentially affirming the community's conquest of the right to name itself, beyond any type of register, official register. And he goes, the name is first and foremost for us a collective one. It is not the sign of an I, but it is the sign of a we. This is what the collective name is. It may be undifferentiated. Its force comes from being chosen and not being imposed. It is not the parental name, it is the concurred name. It is not important whether I'm called X or Glissant, he says. The most important thing is that I'm not subjected to my name, but I assume my name within my community. And this is it, Glissant, for example, mentions very often how he totally refuses to give specific names to trees, to birds, to flowers, to nature. What stands out is significant. And this is something that I really find extremely poignant. Again, a lot in the relationships that have in the sort of net of relations that a lot of the monologues of Nicoline's characters also bring about, like the stories that are revealed by names, that have often been imposed, corrupted, distorted, but at times also chosen. And it is this act of refusal to this duplicity of language that can always name without really expressing, because alone the name does not suffice. And that's what he mentions with pertinent language and what he calls also nom de voisinage, which are the name itself indicates a total process of renaming undertaken by the community, of its people, of its surroundings, of its landscape. And I wanted to close here with this sort of a path following Glissant. And I just wanted to show a very, very tiny fragment of a film. Not a film, actually, it's an interview. It's a tiny fragment of an interview. I admit it's the only fragment of that interview that I found subtitled in English. And this is by Pasolini. This is an interview from 1968 because Pasolini in Italy has been a particularly fervent, how would I call it? A fervent supporter or actually fervent fighter of the homogeneous force of a certain type of Italian language that was chosen over others, and was already calling upon the fear produced by the idea of this homogenization and the consequences of the many different literary languages that defined Italy as a country, that however never got the status of language, which would have allowed to study them at school, to use them, but were maintained just as dialects, which essentially is now, the consequence of it is a slow erosion and disappearance of many, with older generations, basically, they're dying with them. Yeah, and I wanted to just show this very, very tiny fragment because I think that is very interesting to me and how it responds also to this idea of the global English. Of course, on a time where this notion of globality didn't exist yet. So it was actually, the problem was already the sort of link that was brought about by unification alone. And yeah, and maybe then we take it from there in more conversations.
Senta Pasolini, a lei vorremmo domandare come si è verificato questo fatto, che in un paese così diviso, così anche pieno di inimicizie municipali, abbia avuto una lingua molto presto, una lingua unitaria, l'italiano.
Si è verificato nell'unico modo possibile, cioè attraverso la letteratura. L'italiano praticamente è una lingua soltanto letteraria per molti secoli, cioè fino praticamente a 10 o 20 anni fa. Mentre per esempio il francese si è formato come lingua unitaria per ragioni politiche, burocratiche, statali, l'italiano è diventato una lingua unitaria che comprende tutta l'Italia per ragioni puramente letterarie, ripeto. E questo prestigio letterario è nato a Firenze in una situazione storica naturalmente molto diversa dall'attuale. I tre grandi padri dell'italiano, cioè Dante, Petrarca e Boccaccio, si sono imposti al resto della popolazione italiana per ragioni di prestigio letterario.
Questo che significa? Che la maggior parte degli italiani fino a 15 o 20 anni fa non parlava quindi l'italiano in realtà?
No, nemmeno ora si parla l'italiano, perché lei sente il mio italiano, non il suo. Cioè praticamente in questo momento abbiamo un italiano che è strettamente unitario dal punto di vista linguistico, cioè un giornale di Milano usa più o meno lo stesso italiano che un giornale di Palermo. Ma quando gli italiani aprono bocca e parlano ognuno un italiano particolare, regionale, cittadino, individuale. Cioè è la coine dialettizzata, l'italiano dialettizzato.
Thank you, Antonia, for your wonderful talk and your clip. There are about 100 questions I'd like to ask you after this presentation, but I know we won't have time for that. Just a really quick one, again going back to the idea of the spoken word and the written word that also, of course, Avishek mentioned. And you mentioned the idea of the official name and the spoken name, the one that is registered and the one that is not registered. And I've come across this also recently in the edition in Antwerp, where people talked about Jewish names and Hebrew names as being two different things, whereas Hebrew names are things that are registered, maybe, but not always, and are mainly spoken or called. So I was wondering if this is a similar situation where these names are not registered or written down and as such exist as spoken language. Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, in the case of the Caribbeans, absolutely. This is what happened. You know, the registered names were actually only the names basically given by the enslaved people owners. And so this is also what creates a huge issue even in tracing, family histories and family legacies. And so there were, I mean, what he talks about is literally exactly three types of names in a way. There's a parental name, there's the family name that though falls through, with the ocean in a way. Like the passage to the Americas means the sort of non-recognition of that name anymore, and the registering under completely new names. And you see it also, it's completely French. It's all French names. It's terrible. Creole also as a language becomes, I think, legally taught in schools maybe 10, 15 years ago only. And it's taught as a language. It's not a bilinguality. It's actually a language that you can learn. And the idea of the language in community and I think is actually something that is also extremely common actually in vernacular languages in general. And I think I wanted to start with the passion fruits because actually with fruits and herbs, that's really what you notice, the scientific names, which come way after, and are almost entirely Latin, are matched with so many different vernacular, ways of calling it, and most of it come from determinations that come from the community, so to speak. And in fact, there's always something related to their function, to their like literally to their qualities attached to it. In the case of Italy, I mean, for example, one thing that I was, discussing recently, which is always like, for example, it's very hard in general to trace women's histories, because women would be married into a new family and change their name. For example, still in Italy today, actually by default, a child is given the father's name. And if you want to give, the parental name of the mother, you basically need to go into some sort of a, legal action. It's extremely uncommon, and I mean, maybe I'm taking now another roads than your question, but I feel that in that sense also there's like the resistance to it is to add names that maybe are not registered, but is names that you want to give, no matter the legal framework, and that's the child sort of takes on.
The disappearance of female family lines is something that appears in Ilse's text, who's going to read very soon, but it's definitely something that I also had in mind. Just a really quick one in relation to Creole languages and naming. Is there such a thing as a Creole name in that sense? Because you talk about the hidden names or the spoken ones. I assume they were in a mixture of names that then later, from the same mix that later several Creoles arose. But is there such a thing as a Creole name?
Yes. Definitely. I mean, I don't feel I'm following the path of other writers, but definitely, even though something I was talking about again before, actually yesterday, also in relationship to the event today, is the problem with the written aspect of it, like actually there's really an effort right now to also try to think beyond the actual alphabet, and like what would a written form that also is, I mean, because Creole obviously is the outcome of a lot of different elements and layers and cultural layers and human layers. And the question really arose that has to do with naming and written language, like whether there is a different, translation into a literary form that may still take place.
Okay, I hope to hear a lot more about that some other time. We are now going to continue here in the room, but please stay with us and give us your questions after. I'd like to invite to the stage Ilse, Canan, Maria, and Rachael, who will each read a short excerpt or a short monologue from My Name is Language. We'll start with Ilse van Rijn, as said, and she will read a text that was spoken in the piece in Dublin and also appears in some other form in Antwerp. It's Nandini's story or Nandini's text.
Does it work? Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Nicoline, for inviting me. Thank you, Maria, Hidde, for organizing this all. I'm going to read from Nandina's text, and then I will give a reflection from my own perspective on that. I work in a women's aid center. We see women from all backgrounds and classes suffer from domestic violence. And very often they tell us this. First, he stopped me calling by my name, and then he started to beat me up. To take a name away, to unname somebody, is to dehumanize somebody. This is true whatever the cultural conventions. It's prevalent in Europe that women change the surname after marriage. it was under French influence that they started doing that, and not that long ago. The upper classes wanted to co-opt the names of powerful families. So as usual, it was all to do with power and property. And then they pressed that custom onto everybody else. And through various colonialisms, spread it around the world even. Arabic and Persians and East Africans don't do it. The Spanish don't do it. The Indians do. At times, women even change their first as well as their last names in India. I got this friend who got married into a Sikh family. That was a love marriage. Her name was Gauri, and then it was changed into Navdeep or something. She replaced the driving license and the passport. That happens very rapidly where there's an interreligious marriage. Our ancient language is Sanskrit, and from there we take the Hindu names. Islamic names are taken from Arabic. Christian names are rooted in Latin. And for Sikh, they are taken from Punjabi. So I'm Hindu, and if I'm getting married to a Muslim or to a Sikh, they change my name. I might become Sana in a Muslim family and Sarabgit in a Sikh family. It's not a translation. It is a completely different name according to the religion. The changing of the forename causes an identity crisis, and it becomes part of the personality to keep justifying it to everyone. You become short-tempered. I mean, it's good that we adopt some of each other's culture, but you don't have to be showcased with a new name. You are not kind of an object that is transferred from here to there. Women put up with that. My mother has never named my father by his first name. You know what my mother says to call my father? Nandini ke papa, Nandini's father. She never names him because naming is questioning the authority, you see? At the same time, my father is calling my mother by her name all the time. In many cultures, a mature adult must have a child whose name provides a technonym. In that way, you receive a name from the future rather than the past. Of course, a technonym honors a parent, but it also depersonalizes. In Nigeria, I was staying with his family, and the oldest member was called Gran. I tried to understand what her name was, because in a passport, it cannot say Gran, right? No one could tell me. She wouldn't tell me. It felt like her existence was grandma, that she was a function, a category. In India, the female family lines are incredibly hard to trace. On marriage certificates, it might say a woman's maiden name, but on the birth certificates of her children, it would only say the surname of the father. Even in the places where women's rights are better taken care of, people don't tend to know their mother's maiden name. That basically blocks half of your family tree. You are so caught up in everyday life, and you know so many people. But the full names of your mother and your grandmothers you forget? How can you be so disconnected? It's the win of patriarchy. So I'll start my reflection with three questions with which you, Nicoline, started your the interview on which the script is based. So the first question is, what is your name? The second was given it to you. And the third was, what does it translate as? And from there I'll build further on. My name is Ilse van Rijn. My name is a name given to me by my parents. My passport says I have 3 other names. Of the good Catholic tradition, I was baptized and called Ilse, Annie, Marie, Josephine van Rijn. I always hesitate a bit and used to hate to mention this series of names, feeling uncomfortable and ashamed of this list, the religious rituals and my parents' faith in them they symbolize. I've protested against this religious upbringing from an early age on. But when you ask me whether my name translates as something, I can only respond what I've learned. That my first name translates as Elizabeth, which derives from Elisheba, my God has sworn. Elizabeth is the wife of Zacharias and the mother of Saint John the Baptist, to whom she gave birth when she was at least 60 years of age, according to the Gospel of Luke. How can I escape my language, this routine of speaking the language I've learned? Quote, we speak to each other as men have spoken to us for centuries, as they taught us to learn, the French feminist linguist and psychoanalyst Luce Irigaray underlines. But we will fail each other if we continue to speak the same language to each other. We will reproduce the same story, begin the same stories all over again. Don't you feel it? Unquote. Warning her reader not to be distracted by norms and habits, to be attentive to oneself instead, this last question, don't you feel it, is crucial to Irigaray's stance. To listen to oneself implies to be aware of one's bodily self, Irigaray argues. This is exactly the opposite of the logocentrism of patriarchy, this naming apparatus, which is grounded in a rational, one-dimensional understanding of language that both disconnects body and mind and doesn't take into account the female human being, whose sexual difference from the normal and normative male body is thus doubly violated in language use. Like other second-generation feminists, varying from Hélène Cixous to Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde, women were searching for ways of using language that did not describe and implicitly prescribe what, when, where, and how woman should be. In order to do so, they had recourse to poetry as an alternative of linguistic ordering more than once. One could even speak of a feminist poetry movement in the US, for instance. The free form of poetry allowed women to express their personal experience and share them. The persona was done away with. Consciousness-raising groups with their activist and emancipatory potential were organized where poems were written, read, performed, and discussed. Small feminist presses arose, launching heretofore unknown female authors of the time. Female precursors were looked for, exemplifying the positions women could take and inspiring feminist activism and cultural production. Repressed female differences were translated into strengths and used as tools to, quote, dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde would have it. Poetry allowed for a disclosure of a space of meaning that wasn't based on social convention. It enabled women to experience the world otherwise. It is these feminists' urge for what one could call an excess of meaning that interests me here. Language's potential to not only experience, but also to imagine the world otherwise, beyond patriarchal semiotic systems of power and dynamic that were and are still in place. We have fled into proper names, Irigaray continues. We've been violated by them. Not yours, not mine. We don't have names. We change them as men exchange us, as they use us. It's frivolous to be changeable, so long as we are a medium of exchange, unquote. Or in Nandini's words, that's the win of patriarchy. In her introduction of the book, Nicoline mentions, a proposition of a future language implies a proposition for a future world. Picking up on Irigary's thought, I suggest writing with the world. No either or, but and. I propose to create a future language world that makes up for the lacunae, the losses and silences in the patriarchal archive Nandini discusses, thus allowing for missing names to be retrieved. In order to do so, the sensory aspects of language need to be taken into account. Language is also sound, language is rhythm. Tapping into the rhythm of language as breath allows one to connect to stories that are lacking, to hear them, to touch them, to feel them, to be close to them, to imagine them, to embody them. Bringing these new or largely forgotten linguistic aspects and stories in the world enables a reconfiguration of that world. In the future language world, material and semiotic aspects of language are entangled. Keeping Nandini's story and the current state of the world in mind, it is crucial to take a step beyond the mostly binary logic of man-woman characterizing Irigary's philosophy. Being of this world today, in a material and semiotic sense, means interacting with this world, understood as post-human, a multi-species proliferation of life in the plural. A future language world is a relational world of co-creation, not of a unilateral communication, but of communion instead. This, it seems to me, is the only way in which you can get back what is lost. This, it seems to me, is the only path preventing us from reproducing the same stories we've been taught. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilse. I'd now like to ask Rachael Rakes to read the story of Jite.
Names are abnormal linguistic objects. They are proper nouns. They are elements in speech. They are sounds that activate the part of your brain that collects names, your onomasticon. Names are not just classifiers. My whole life, people struggle to wrap their tongue around my name. People have told me that I pronounce my own name wrong, and that if I change the spelling, they may say it more correctly. But that means that when I look at it, it won't be mine anymore. I sacrifice the pronunciation because I think I write it more than I say it. I have to look at it on a screen every day. And also, you don't just say your name out loud all the time. Like, I share a house with a friend. We don't say, Jite? Yes, Dave? Where's the remote, Jite? Right there on the table, Dave. Jite is my name. It's Robo. My mother, she always wanted to have a baby girl. She had 1 boy, 2 boys, 3 boys, 4 boys. Myself, I was the 5th boy, and she called me enough. Maybe it gives me a setback that I was enough. I am always content with what I have. I'm like, enough. In Africa, most people know at least 3 languages, and they pick the one they need in a given situation. It's the same with names. We give names to different versions of ourselves, not in the sense of an actor playing different roles, but there are multiple personal essences. All across the African continent, there is a culture of the recitation of names and place names. It is like the bardic pattern you have in the Celtic and the Norse traditions. Before telling a story, the whole genealogy of the heroes has to be gone through. To give a family continuity in time and space, to provide a stable label and appellative. We have 7,000 languages on the planet, and only 280 are standardized. And 70 of them dominate the world. All the other languages are in permanent transition. Names can be stabilized and canonized like languages. The more complex social structure, the more fixed the names. In open urban network societies, you need to have exact labels. The system needs to take your taxes, to punish you, and to send you to the military, to monitor your data. But if reference were all I cared about, I might as well be named with numbers. You see it all over the world. The old establishment keeps the names of the ancestors. But in the lower social economic class, names are more subject to fashion. Ronaldo, Beyonce, it's a self-naming thing. Why is it supposed to be in bad taste? We should all use this powerful tool of self-naming. Socrates pointed out that only slaves cannot name themselves. I'm just going to share a couple of personal, maybe kind of banal things, but jumping off from this quote, the more complex the social structure, the more fixed the names, from Jite's text. I come from the US, and so that quote spoke to me, let's say. Before I was born, it was decided that if I had blonde hair, I would be named Stephanie. If I was brunette, I would be called Rachael. I was born with a full head of black hair, but I'm still called Rachael. There was supposed to be some kind of correlation with what it meant to be a Stephanie and what it meant to be a Rachael. Stephanies are lighter, happier. Rachels are more serious, temperamentally darker. This is true. When I was born, I'm all but certain there were no other Rachael Rakeses, at least in the United States, alive. There is now at least one other Rachael Rakes, who spells her name slightly differently than mine. She spells it the way that people commonly misspell my name. That means that the other Rachael Rakes, because of this frequent misspelling, consistently receives messages meant for me. Consequential things have gone to her, related to grants received, job decisions, invitations, and intimate personal notes. She has red hair. She's also American, and in many ways, at least I guess I like to think, oppositional to me. She's a Trump supporter living in Texas. Despite our differences, she kindly forwards my emails, or at least the emails she figures must be meant for me and not her. I'll never know if she forwards all of them, or decides to make a selection, or when she'll get tired of it and stop. She has told me to tell my people to learn how to spell my name correctly, but I can never get to them all in advance of misspelling my name.
Cool. Canan, I'd like to ask you to read Marie-France's story. Time is a factor today because we have a limited time that we are actually allowed in this room because of you know what. So I'm going to have to ask you to stick to the time. Thank you.
I was born in Congo in 1982, in the era of Mobutu. And Mobutu was all about economic, political, and cultural independence, the pride of being Zairian, no more use of French, the language of the Belgian colonizers, No more Catholicism, the religion of the colonizers. And no more French or Catholic names. So in 1967, he had introduced his policy, return to authenticity. He changed his own name from Joseph Désiré Mobutu to Mobutu Sese Seko Nkukun Bendu Wazabanga. And from then on, everyone was obliged to have authentic Congolese names. It wasn't that all French first names had to be translated to one of the languages of Congo. They simply disappeared from any official document. And everybody has to use a Congolese post name, which was then written down after the former last name, because that old structure of a first name and a last name was in itself also a colonial structure. The missionaries had had this idea. We're going to baptize these people, and then we will give them a first name and a family name, and the family name will be the father's name, and women will take their husband's names. But in the original African context, parents didn't necessarily pass on their names on in that way. Parents could give a child only one name. Siblings sometimes didn't even have any name in common. So the concept of the post name was kind of a subversion of the colonial system as well. So, I was born in the era of l'authenticité. My family name is Vodikulwakidi, and my post name is Kiabelo. And my parents really wanted to give me a first name, even if they couldn't register it. And they chose Marie-France. You see, my grandfather was a very Francophile kind of guy, even though he has never had the opportunity to travel to Europe. And he called his son Maurice, Maurice Vodikulwakidi. And Maurice, my dad, a true lover of the French language, made it a point of honor to instill in us Franco-Belgian customs and traditions, as did my mother. That's why they called me Marie-France. And my father added the W to my family name so that it would be easy to pronounce in French. Vodikulwakidi. My father had an opportunity to work for a mining and extraction company in Belgium, so we all moved here as a family. And I was registered as Vodikulwakidi Kiabelo, without Marie-France, because that's what it said on my birth certificate. I grew up here without a first name, but Belgian society was not exactly prepared for that. You have to give your first name in many places, at school, at work, when purchasing something online. In my passport, in the box for first name, there's nothing. There's just nothing there. And on my bank card, I have X. And otherwise, there is FNU, first name unknown, or first name unavailable. At the airport, I am very often stopped and questioned, or even searched. Is it because I wear sweatpants during a long-distance flight instead of a suit? Or because I am the only girl of color who is traveling alone and regularly changes her hairstyle? Or maybe it's because of my lack of a first name. Also, there is new anti-terrorism legislation coming up, and apparently banks can no longer keep bank accounts for people who don't have an address or who don't have a first name. A lot of Congolese who were born in Congo before 1997, like me, have the same problem. A Congolese friend of mine said she wouldn't want to add a first name, even if it could be done. I was born with that name, so why do I have to add a first name to it? That's also a form of colonial resistance, isn't it? Keeping such a name is a way of telling the story of the colonization. A bit like in the way of our common namesake, X, Malcolm X. For him, the X was a placeholder for the lost name of his African ancestors who were enslaved and taken to America. The X marked the spot where the name had been. It indicated an absence. Meanwhile, in Congo, you see on every passport family name, post name, and again, first name. There it is. Mobutu has been gone since 1997, and the Congolese have those French first names again. But parents of the youngest generation more and more choose Congolese-sounding names. The most popular ones are Eliksha and Zinga, after an old Congolese queen. L'authenticité is back, but in a different way. There's renaissance of identity. Africans today are proud of their countries, their cultures, and the riches of their continent. Nicoline, I want to thank you to have gifted me this text. Really, thank you. It's the Marie-France text is really, but you gave me this one, so it's a very important connection for me. And thank you, Maria, for allowing this space for expressing these thoughts. Before reading Marie-France's story in English, I have listened to her telling it in French. I immediately felt the connection with her through the story of her first name, a story of resilience, of absence, of translation or lack thereof, of pain caused by the erasure of who we are, at least parts of who we are, which is partly expressed through our names. Marie-France and I have Belgium in common and the French language. Our experiences are rooted in different geographical, political, cultural contexts, but they exist in movement. A movement which is supposed to enrich the history of Belgium, but that Belgium, its institutions, its system, some of its people, hasn't been able to embrace yet. My parents migrated to Belgium from Turkey in 1980, the year of the military coup in Turkey. I was 1 year old and on my way to becoming a future Belgian. I recognize many things in Marie-France's story, even though my first name never officially disappeared. And as I said, we do come from very, very different contexts. But the way Belgium has treated our names says everything about the state of Belgium and its incapacity to embrace the so-called other. We, those European others, as academic Fatima Al-Tayeb coined people like me and Marie-France in her book, European Others, Queer in Ethnicity in Post-National Europe. Our fathers and Marie-France's grandfather made similar choices in their attempt to embrace the host country's traditions and culture. Her parents named her Marie-France. My father would call me Joanna. Not officially, but when they named me, he thought that Canan could easily translate across borders and become many variations of the Turkish original. He did not take the spelling into account, C-A-N-A-N, which became Canan, Canon, or Conan the Barbarian in the school courtyard. But over the years, as I kept explaining the pronunciation, my name was transformed in a myriad of ways. I used to resist this. I thought my name was my identity and shouldn't be butchered. Now, as I evolved, I have embraced the fact that my name was as fluid as my many identities. I had to find a balance. For instance, Marie-France's father adding a W to their name reminded me of my father letting everyone call him Maras, so instead of Marasligil. Never Abdullah, never Monsieur Marasligil, Maras, or sometimes Monsieur Maras. It was easier for them. Today, even if I play with my first name spelling and pronunciation, I always keep my last name in full, and maybe this is a form of resistance against the erasure of my origins. And I also would think, 6 decades of immigration on this continent, and you still don't know how to pronounce my name? So I find balance because I embrace fluidity in all my identities. The stories created by my name are moving identities. This is also what I felt when I listened to Marie-France's story. There are so many layers in the story of her name, and the personal is always political. Marie-France's name tells a story of Belgian colonization and its aftermath. Mine tells a story of Turkish immigration in Belgium. They both show what Marie-France herself expresses. Belgian society was not exactly ready for that. I guess Marie-France and I can join our stories, the stories of our names, and ask, when will Belgium be ready? And this could be applied to the Netherlands and many other European countries. Marie-France and I seem to have already embraced, and we evolve to and grow into one, two, maybe many more post names. So now I can ask, when will you be ready? Thank you.
Your mic. Finally, Maria Hlavajova will read a short text from her namesake, Maria Goretti, or Mary. There is in every edition a little piece about a Mary, because Mary is a very common name, of course, with many, many stories attached to it. So I'll give the mic.
Thank you very much. And Nicoline, I'm aware we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to work on it. I'm your ally here. Mary. I go by the same name as you. I was born in 1954, which is what they call a Marian year in the Catholic Church. It was a year to honor Our Lady. So most of the baby girls were called Mary, or some derivative of Mary. Now, I was born toward the end of that year, and most types of Mary had already been taken. So my parents christened me Maria Goretti, after an Italian girl who was sanctified only 4 years earlier. Maria Goretti was the patron saint of chastity, teenage girls, and rape victims. And God knows what else. According to the Catholic Church, she was born into a very, very poor family. And at the age of 11, one of her neighbors threatened to rape her. She warned the neighbor that he would go to hell and said she would rather die than submit to him. He then stabbed her several times, after which she underwent surgery without anesthetic. And halfway through that operation, she managed to speak and express forgiveness to her attacker. She then died of her wounds. Well, as a child, the story of Maria Goretti completely freaked me out. I came to believe I was not going to live to be older than 11 myself. I never told my mom this, but on my 12th birthday, I was so relieved that I had survived. And you asked me to make a couple of very small and quick comments around my name, and it's very hard to develop a story around the name of Maria. And in contrast to this particular story I read, of course, my name was given to me in a very atheist context of a communist country, and was a chosen name from a state offer of names, 365 names. So that first very sentence from the story I have just read, I identify really strongly with, I go by the same name as you. That would be the sentence that I remember from my childhood as the most repeated one in my own life. However, if I was given the name Maria, or in fact Maria, I was never called it. My community called me Maya. My mother, with love, called me Maika, diminutive version of Maria or Maria. And my father, of course, called me Micho because he, of course, desired to have a boy. But the most beautiful moment that I recall is where Maika Micho or Micho Maika have been used and thrown around as a language of love. However, the name Maria Hlavajova, has been the name of authority and government, And until today, when I hear the proper pronunciation, which I sacrificed in the Netherlands, when I hear the proper pronunciation, I get shivers and angst and fear. However, when I moved to the Netherlands, I lost all those beautifully loved versions of name, and Maria is what stuck with me, and I think it has defined my position within the community within which I work and live, because to some extent it refers to that version of authoritarian Maria. So I think when I dream about my childhood, I actually dream about return to that place of love. That would be the names given to me by my parents, Micho Maika or Maika Micho. I leave it here.
Thank you, our 4 readers. And I think Avishek and Antonia are still there. Fantastic, thank you. Okay. Hida just tells me that Antonia's computer has crashed and she won't be able to join us for the final, unfortunately, 10 minutes of talk. I would like actually then to ask Avishek, if we hear all the stories on stage that I've heard, I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to comment or question, but I guess a single question that comes out of them is the question whether we can, I'm looking there, whether we can, if it's possible to name ourselves, and if so, in what language do we do that, or in whose language do we do that? And now really going back to the beginning of this evening, is there something in your work that would, at least in part, answer that question?
You're asking me, right?
I'm asking it to you.
Yeah, no, it's I don't think I have an answer. I just wanted to it was really great hearing the excerpts performed. It brings out a dimension that obviously would not have come out by only reading them. I don't know. I mean, I have nothing to add. I mean, I think that everything, there's so many things that have been said about the act of naming. I mean, I'm just thinking, I mean, it is fraught. It's a very, very fraught exercise, as we know, as we have learned from all these experiences. It's a very political process, in some sense, and I'm not saying this, I'm not the first person saying this, is that, naming and languaging can be thought of as synonymous, right? I mean, language is activated in the act of naming. So it's not just a part of language. I think almost, language, I mean, of course, there are names, nouns, and verbs, but I also think that in a way that language itself comes into, action by the act of naming, in some sense. And obviously, I mean, the eraser of names, renaming, I think self-naming is probably the thing that's that I want to think a little more about. I don't know. I mean, that's an act of reclaiming ownership, etc. But other than that, it's such a political process. It's an exercise of power. It's a withholding of power. I was thinking of some of the things that Antonia was saying, and I know she's not here, about naming not just of humans, but objects and plants and fruits and things. I mean, this kind of, particularly the context that she was talking about, the Americas, but everywhere, right? It's I mean, it's also, as you say in your work, that it's the what's the status of translation when it comes to naming. I mean, it's what is lost, what is gained. It's I guess, as I said, I don't have an answer, just a bunch of thoughts. It's very evocative to hear them and kind of just responding to that. I don't want to take up all the time we have, but that's those are probably some responses. I'd love to hear if anybody else has other thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Avishek. I would also then, since you mentioned translation, which was definitely high on my list, we have a translator here, Canan, and I'm making a quick connection already with Ilse's work because you talk about poetry and you talk about the invention of women's languages by second wave feminists. Do we say second wave? I think that's a different thing. And you also refer to poetry in relation to, let's say, emancipatory languages or the act of translation. And I would really like to hear from you both a little bit about that, but maybe I see Canan is ready for an answer there.
Well, for me, because I'm also a poet and I perform poetry, for me it's a space of freedom, poetry, and I can do whatever with language, but also naming, and probably you will recognize this in many practices too. It's that freedom that you're not always allowed in other spaces when you write, because I'm also do other types of writing, and poetry really gives you that space, not only for your writing, but for the receiver as well. You are not judged in the same way, like that just happened in the text, you know? So that's for me is very interesting. The possibilities also, and also translating poetry. I hate when people say you cannot translate poetry. It's not true, you can translate poetry. It will just be different. And those emotions and this human experience will exist in other languages as well. It will just be different.
And so in that sense, can you translate names?
Yes, you can. I mean, I would. It really depends. And if you're lucky to work with a poet who's alive, then you ask the poet and you work together, and then you transform it into something different. And that's fine. You know, I don't look for equivalence anymore. I'm not interested anymore as a translator in equivalence at all. We can transform it into something new. And that's fine. And that's the fluidity again. You know, fluidity comes back in everything I do and also in my translation work.
And if you think of names outside of the poetic context or the literary context, are names translatable?
Well, again, it depends what you translate always. But that's why I don't put general rules on these. I take it for each text, each piece of work requires different reflection and different choices. And if you can make these choices together collectively, this is also something I believe in very much, you know, the collective effort, working collectively on something. And that can be with other translators or other authors, and then you create, again, something new. And the post, that's why I really love what Marie-France talks about, these post names, the idea of post, you know, creating something on top of something and transform.
So you would say we're adding on rather than removing or translating?
Yeah, I don't remove, adding on, yeah, and making richer. Maybe creating a new language even.
What about you, Ilse? You mentioned also in your talk.
Yeah, I'm hesitating there because I have a bit of a problem with categorizations. So to divide really poetry from prose and other forms of language use. So that's why I'm hesitant as well to bring up poetry. But apparently in this so-called second wave, well, question mark there, but that's another topic. Women experienced poetry as a form of expression with which they could oppose the reigning regime and the form of language which was in place then and there. So, yeah, as I mentioned, people organized, or women organized these consciousness raising groups and saw that within, or what they called poetry, they could express themselves in other ways. So both going against conventional social conventions, but also against conventions which were in place in poetry. So a double opposition there. But yeah, I think what I find interesting is to use poetry also as a metaphor for social resistance in large. So not necessarily only within feminism, but you see it that it happened in feminism. So using it as an example, how it was used then and there, and learning from that and how we can bring that further right now.
Thank you. I wonder if there is a question from either the floor, Rachael or Maria, or from somebody in the audience, because now would be the time, or from Avishek, of course.
You can just speak up. Speak up. No, yeah, you can just speak. Yeah. No, you don't have to. You don't have to pick it up.
Oh, I'm speaking.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Hassel, and I watched the performance of sorry, I'm super nervous. And I watched the performance of My Name is Language, and there's something really interesting that, because I'm Asian, to be more specific, I'm Chinese, so my mother language is quite different from those language in the video. And the title of My Name is Language draws my attention all the time when I was watching the video, because for me, I mean, it's a sentence, don't need to prove in a way that, because for my language, I mean, it just was very interesting that for my language, I knew what does it mean when somebody speak it out. Like, so that's, I mean, so I don't really know what's my question, but when I was watching yeah, it's really true. But when I was watching because my tutor recommended me your performance and your things is very nice. But on the other hand, I was very confused when I was watching the My Name is Language, because it sounds like not really belong to my context. And after I watched the performance, I went to the street and randomly meet some people which looks like European appearance. Then I asked them that if they can realize the meaning of their name. They said no. Then it was yesterday, just happened yesterday. It was the first time I realized the difference between my language and, because my language is analytic language. Those Germany, French, Dutch, Italy is fusion language, I guess. So that's a very huge difference. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in the topic of My Name is Language. But on the other hand, it's some...
Can I just...
yeah, sure.
I'm going to also repeat part of your question to Avishek and to others who may not have been able to hear. I didn't catch your name, I'm sorry. But you are originally from China,
Yeah.
right? And you watched My Name is Language on video recently and were really confused about the fact that some people may not know what their name means.
Yeah.
Because there are indeed, I know this also from Chinese names, but not all of them, as far as I understood, are kind of lexically transparent. They're made up of words that also appear in dictionaries and that actually have meaning and can be read or interpreted in a certain way. Whereas a lot of other names in this world are not working like that, although they were maybe at some earlier point functioning in that way. And in the projects that I have done so far, Chinese names have not appeared. We had one piece about a Mongolian young man, but he spoke in English, and we did talk a little bit about his name, but it's also a lexically transparent way of naming. And so I find it really interesting that you're confused about this, because it is confusing the other way around when you kind of have people translate their names in front of you. But I think the questions that we are posing here still exist, because your name is still language, but even if we don't know it, we would still need to find a way to work with it or to grasp it fully. But thank you for bringing that up, because it is something that is definitely part of the project. I'm now quickly trying to think of examples in earlier editions where I think it is actually Jite's text, also Urobo, where Jite literally means enough. And this word is also recognizable as enough to people in Nigeria or certain parts of Nigeria. So there also a name has this meaning that can be read and understood. But thank you. It's time. And I really, when we discussed this event previously, I really hoped for an event that would bring all the topics in the book further, or that would launch me into new areas to work with and to think about. And that has absolutely happened. So I'm extremely happy and grateful for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for being there. Avishek, thank you for your presence.
Thank you. It's been great.
And we're going to have to close now. Thank you for joining us online, wherever you are. And the book is still for sale. You can also buy it on Eclectic. Again, your EPUB is waiting for you. And good night. Be good. Be safe.
And perhaps a few more thank yous also to our tech team here. Thank you very much for bringing this event to light both off and online. And congratulations, Nicoline. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.